Welcome to our program. Today we will discuss the current situation in Syria with Professor Joshua Landis. He is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma. I am Marianne Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and we're glad you joined us today. If you enjoyed today's discussion, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming programs, such as our show tomorrow on Latin America with Paul Angelo, our conversation with NASA's former chief engineer, Evelyn Morales, on the future of space, and our dialogue with Dr. Peniel Joseph on the biographies of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So be sure to ring the bell on your screen to subscribe. Now on to our program. Joining us today is Joshua Landis. Professor Landis is director of the Center for Middle East Studies and professor at the University of Oklahoma's College of International Studies. In addition to authoring a daily newsletter on Syrian politics, he is a frequent speaker at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, the Brookings Institute, the Institute of Peace, the Middle East Institute, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Joined by the Council's own Basma Ghori. Professor, it's a pleasure having you with us today.
It's great to be here. I've spoken at Houston a few times, but this is my first on Zoom, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Marianne. Good evening, everyone. A special welcome to those from the University of Oklahoma. We are very glad you are joining us today. As Marianne mentioned, my name is Basma, and I'm delighted to be moderating our discussion. Joshua, before we take a look at the current state of Syria, I would like to remind our audience the dynamics of the conflict. Of course, there are many variables such as economic hardship and sectarian issues, but could you share a brief overview of what initiated the Syrian Civil War, the key players involved, and what their specific interests are in the war?
Absolutely. And again, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for inviting me. Everybody in Syria wanted reform and change in 2011 when this uprising began. The Ba'ath Party had been ruling Syria since 1963. That's 50 years of dictatorship. The Alawite family of the Assad family and Alawite consolidation had taken place in 1970 with Hafez al-Assad's coup, the father of Bashar. So they'd been ruling for 40 years, one family. And like so many of the uprisings that ripped across the Middle East that year, they were trying to get rid of these dictatorships, which were turning into dynasties. And there are many economic causes, as you said. Neoliberal reforms had destroyed the Ba'athist alliance with the Syrian farmers and countryside and the working class. So they were unhappy. The rich, the upper 5% of Syria had done very well in the last decade since these neoliberal reforms. Government services, however, had declined badly. Schools, hospital, government stores that subsidized goods, the state sector, all those things were flagging. And this led to a real income gap in Syria. Certain sectors were going gangbusters. Those were a new banking sector, tourism. Syria had opened up its barriers and let imports come in, which meant that there were a lot of fancy high goods stores for the first time in Syria, and it made poor people realize they were missing out. And rich people began to flaunt their wealth, driving, Mercedes and Porsches around when most people couldn't even afford a car. Stock market was introduced. Pharmaceutical companies were building lots of firms. Television and film industry exploded. Cultural parts of Syria began to provide films across the Middle East. And even things like shoe factories were going very well because the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 destroyed all Iraqi industry, and they had to begin to import. So Syria could go in on the low-end goods, manufactured goods like shoes, did well. But there were also a big drought in Syria, the worst drought in hundreds of years, that drove 1 million people off the land and into the cities. And the US invasion of Iraq caused heightened sectarianism. Over 1 million refugees fled into Syria. This caused a lot of property values went way up. There was a lot of inflation involved with that. So there was terrible class differences and a big income gap. And those were the economic factors. But of course, there was this small sectarian group at the top, which had monopolized politics for so long, and many people wanted change.
Right. And what does the current situation look like, and how is Syria fighting for freedom at this time? I know just today a fuel truck bomb went off, unfortunately, killing more than 40 people.
Right. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the key players that I didn't mention last time, and that there's several key players. Of course, there's the Assad family, but there's the Alawites sitting at top. About 12% of Syrians are Alawites, a heterodox Shiite group that has backed the president and been really the backbone of the regime. And it's so important in Syria to understand these sectarian, these religious and communal differences. In some ways, it's not completely analogous to what's happening in Israel, but it's a little bit like Jews against the Palestinians. They're
Right.
two different communities that feel that don't trust each other, and they feel that losing would mean getting wiped out. And the Alawites have felt that way, which is, I think, helps understand why this war has been so bloody and so much more bloody than most of the other Middle Eastern wars. There are the other religious minorities. About 10% of Syria are Christians and Druze, Ismailis, and they have tended to support the Assad government for fear of Islamists taking over. They're Kurds, 10% ethnic minority, and we know about the Kurds because they have sided with America, at least for part of the time, and they've been alienated both from the rebels and from the Syrian government. They would like to have a great deal of autonomy, if not independence, in northern Syria. And then there's the Sunni Arab majority of 70%, but they're extremely divided themselves. There's an upper class, many of whom, and a upper middle class that have remained loyal to the regime. If not loyal, many of them don't like the regime, but they're frightened of the rebels. And that's why the cities joined into this uprising last. Cities like Aleppo, the center of the city did not join in, and the rebels really had to come in and force it. And then, of course, the city got bombed because it was in rebel territory, just what the people were fearing, and it got destroyed. And so a lot of the wealthier people worried that their wealth would get destroyed, which it did. And so they were very hesitant to join the rebels, who really started out in the countryside. And it was the countryside that really rose up against the urban centers and against this regime. So those have been the main actors. And of course, there are Islamists. I could go into the different groups, but the Sunni Arab majority has been extremely fragmented. And that's what's caused the length, the duration, and the complication in this. Because America and Europeans thought, oh, if we can just get the Sunni majority together to turn against the minorities, we can win, and we'll get rid of the Assad regime. But it didn't work out that way, because the militias didn't unite. There were Islamists, there were secular groups, there were a lot of different groups who could not unify.
And what about Iran and Russia? What have their roles been and their particular interests in this war?
Well, that's the situation in Syria really changed in 2015 when Russia jumped into this war. And that's what turned it around. And at the same time, really two things were happening at the same time. Not only did Russia jump in and send in its air force, which of course was crucial to Assad's success, but the United States and Europe got spooked by the Syrian opposition, because ISIS had taken over almost half of Syria. Al-Qaeda was very well ensconced in the north and a very important power. And so the United States turned away from the Sunni Arab opposition because it turned out not to be secular, not pro-American, and it was those allies that America had were losing. in the struggle between Islamists versus non-Islamists. And so America abandoned the rebels. So did the Gulf states. Qatar, Saudi Arabia turned away from them and joined America in trying to destroy ISIS and other elements of the opposition. So that's gave Assad a second life, and it allowed Iran, who supported Assad, of course, and Russia, to become the paramount powers in Syria, to remain the paramount. They'd always been the paramount powers, but the United States had hoped that in this revolution they could get rid of them both and make Syria, bring Syria into their own sphere of influence. And that didn't happen. It failed, as we know.
Right. And Joshua, could you discuss the impact and results of the various international sanctions that have been imposed on Syria as a response to this conflict?
Absolutely. You know, sanctions have been fairly devastating for the Syrian regime, and they are right now because America has many different layers of sanction. And we just recently put on a new, it's called the Caesar Act, which also brings on secondary sanctions. So any business people or companies that try to reconstruct Syria, sell it oil, energy, build electric plants, redo the electric plants, they will also get sanctioned by the United States. So it really has frozen out any foreign companies that might think of investing in Syria. For example, I send money to my wife's family. We send money to my wife's family. And I send money to a classmate of mine where I went in the 80s who lives in Deir ez-Zor. And his house was destroyed. He was a refugee and he's gone back home. He's trying to rebuild it. And so I was sending him a monthly little stipend, but I can't send it anymore. There's no banking. There's even Lebanon, now that they've had their financial crisis, I used to send it through Lebanon and he would have a cousin that could go to Lebanon, pick up the money, bring it back. Now you can't do that because Lebanon has closed down all dollar denominations. You can send dollars, but even with, what's that service where you send money through the wiring service, they can't take it out in dollars anymore. So there's a state currency level that, so they're getting ripped off by 20% of their money. And so it's very difficult for anybody to help their relatives. It really has frozen the banking system and everything else. So it's devastating to Syria, and that's left the country in a real shambles because, let me just talk for a few minutes about the destruction level because there's some statistics that are worth going over here. 34 of the 54 power plants that make electricity are inoperable today and need to be fixed. Mm-hmm. That means Syrians are getting electricity for an hour or two a day. They're sort of rolling blackouts because the government tries to switch it around. Right. GDP, gross domestic product, has fallen by 2/3 from $55 billion to about $22 billion. Recovery costs, about $300 billion, we believe the UN estimates are needed to rebuild Syria. That's 15 times current GDP. Last year's annual budget of the Syrian government was $9 billion. $1 billion was slated for reconstruction. And they need $300 billion. So they're putting $1 billion at a time. So it shows you how difficult it is. 45% of housing has been destroyed. 24% of it has completely been razed. Over 1/2 of all the hospitals and health facilities in the country have been destroyed or are inoperable today. And about, 40% of the schools, I could go on, but all of that reconstruction that's necessary can't go on. And the United States is standing between all the international agencies that might help with that and saying, no, we're not going to do that because we want leverage against we want the Assad regime to transition out and give power to the opposition.
Right, these are very significant effects. Reflecting on these, has there been any leniency because of the coronavirus pandemic?
That's a good question. The leadership of the EU has asked the United States if they could, undo some of those things in order to facilitate the coronavirus situation. And the United States has stood firm. They don't want to do that either with Iran or with Syria because, they feel that Europe is trying to get away and reestablish some kind of links to the Assad regime, which America is very eager not to have happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. In 2019, the U.S. began withdrawing troops from Syria, which raised question of the impacts of U.S. withdrawal and also the morality behind that decision. Could you share your thoughts on that?
Yes. The abandonment of the Kurds was, of course, it was very embarrassing. 2019, the United States, when it turned away from the Sunni Arab opposition because ISIS had grown to owning about half of Syrian territory. Mm-hmm. America wanted to destroy ISIS because it had moved into Iraq. Remember, in the summer of 2014, ISIS swept from Syria into Iraq. It had started in Iraq because it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq just transformed it to ISIS. The Syrian Civil War gave it a new lease on life, and then it came sweeping back in Iraq, almost to the borders of Baghdad. So the United States freaked out and said, we've got to destroy this thing. And in order to do it, they asked first the Sunni Arab rebels if they would help in Syria, and they said, no, we want to take down Assad first, then we'll deal with ISIS. So America turned to the Kurds, this 10% ethnic minority in northern Syria, who immediately signed on because ISIS was destroying them. And so they signed on with America and have been extremely loyal. About 10,000 Kurds have been killed in the fight against ISIS, and they were extremely successful. America did not have to put boots on the ground. And they helped America destroy ISIS. And then, of course, as soon as that was successful, President Trump decided to withdraw. And in part, that withdrawal was because Turkey was threatening the United States, right. Not only threatening an invasion of Syria, Turkey was furious because they regarded the YPG, the Kurdish forces in Syria that had been helping the United States, as a terrorist group that was synonymous with the PKK, their big Kurdish terrorist organization that wants to secede the eastern parts of Turkey, to secede from Turkey. And so they were furious that America would be arming and training all these Kurds who are allied to their biggest threat, national threat. And America, this caused real deterioration in the relations. So President Trump, I think, wanted to fix that relationship with Turkey. He wanted to get out of Syria, and he just pulled he announced it overnight, and it caused complete chaos, both with all of our forces in the region who felt badly embarrassed because they had been promising the Kurds. But, this raises the larger term question of when you arm up a minority like this to help you destroy a regime or an ISIS or whatever it's going to be, of course they come to depend on you, on the United States, and think that you're going to stay with them and you're going to protect them forever. And America had no intention of doing that. So in a sense, one has to use a certain amount of deceit to get what you want in war. And this is the inevitable downside of arming up a minority to try to, we did this we promised the Shiites in Iraq that they rose up against Saddam, and we didn't. The Kurds, we've done a number of times. This has happened over and over again. We're doing it in Afghanistan today with all of the pro-American forces in Afghanistan and withdrawing, perhaps we're going to withdraw. And that means that they're going to get destroyed or badly hurt. And that's what's going to happen to the Kurds. Of course, President Trump did it in a very disorganized fashion. Mm-hmm. But I think that we were going to let the Kurds down one way or the other because they're only 10% of Syria. All of their neighbors don't want them to have independence. And they were counting on us for a large measure of autonomy, if not independence, in northern Syria. And so how would we, I don't think in the long run, America will be able to defend them. It's going to let them down with a thump sometime.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I want to switch gears and talk about Assad. How has this conflict affected Assad's presidency and his credibility domestically and also on the global stage? I know previously you've commented that he has come out as a winner in this conflict.
Well, he's the winner, militarily on the ground. He's gotten most of his territory back. Of course, there are big hunks of Syria that are still owned by the Kurds, by Turkey and opposition, Arab opposition, and or in Idlib province by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led this group. It's a Salafi jihadist group led by Jawlani, who used to be a member of Al-Qaeda and then a member of ISIS, and then he set up his own shop and has made alliances elsewhere and moved away from those. But those are three big hunks of Syria that are still outside of the government's purview. So Assad, of course, is very badly damaged. He, Europe and the United States won't have anything to do with him. There's sanctions. His budget last year was $9 billion, and his GDP has collapsed. On the other hand, if we look at from his point of view, he's held on. He would see that he's protected his community from possible ethnic cleansing. He sees the opposition as having been dominated by Islamist terrorists, as he called them, which of course is a very self-serving accusation. He has Iran, Russia, and China on his side, his biggest backers. But Iraq and Lebanon are also allies, dominated by Shiite governments. Egypt and Sisi look to him as a military dictator. They want him to survive and not the Islamist opposition. Algeria as well. The Arab League has talked about letting him back in. Even the UAE has opened their embassy. The Libyan Haftar has opened an embassy, hoping that he can hurt the Turks. And so there is a lot of politics. Even Saudi Arabia is beginning to move towards recognition. America's asked it not to do that, but it's worried about Iran's influence, and it would like to compete with Iran in Syria. So Assad is moving slowly, very slowly, back into regaining some of his position. And of course, the UN never disowned him. He's still the legitimate, the government in Damascus is still considered the legitimate government of Syria, unlike Gaddafi, where the UN decided he was not the government and turned against him. So in that sense, Assad he's still there, but he's in definite, isolation. It's not North Korea, but it's somewhere in between.
Thank you, Joshua. Lastly, before we open it up to the audience questions, what are the proposals for resolution to this conflict and to finally restore Syria as the once vibrant epicenter of trade it was? I know some scholars have been commenting on a historic opportunity stemming from the current coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I don't see any opportunities, not for the United States, for sure. What are U.S. objectives? They want regime transition, Assad to go. The U.S. envoy to Syria, Jeffries, wants a UN-backed election. That's what he claims is going to happen in the future. The opposition is going to take part in government, that Iran should get out entirely from Syria. That's another U.S. demand. And that, we would like to hurt Russia in Syria and deny them a vibrant country and a foothold in the Middle East. Water. I'm getting water. And are these realistic goals? That's really what America needs to, can it succeed in getting its goals with the tools that it has? And what are the tools? It has sanctions. It can diplomatically isolate Syria and keep the EU and other countries like Saudi Arabia from recognizing it. There's no reconstruction by any international organization. It's kept any international, including the EU organizations, from helping with reconstruction. No trade with Iraq. It has soldiers on the main highway at Tunf between Iraq, Baghdad, and Damascus, so there can't be trade. And it's withholding Syrian oil. As Trump said, we're going to defend Syrian oil, which means keeping it out of the hands of the government of Damascus so that we have economic leverage. But those tools aren't enough. We can beggar Syria, we can make it very poor, but that's really going to hurt the Syrian people. And that's who we're hurting the most. The most vulnerable Syrian people are starving, and they can't rebuild. Assad is sitting in his palace, and his men are getting what they want. So we can hold the Syrian people hostage, hoping that Assad will leave for the Syrian people. Well, we know he's not going to do that. So our tools are not enough to get what we want, at least what we state we want. I'm not sure that anybody in Washington still believes we're going to get those things. Maybe they're just satisfied that if we can keep Syria as weak as possible, it'll hurt Iran and Russia, who will have a liability on their hand. And that may be just good enough for the United States, but it's not going to bring Syria back to any vibrancy. We're going to make sure that it remains poor and fragmented and not a threat to our allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and has little influence in the region, and not a help to our enemies, Iran and Russia.
Thank you, Joshua. That's certainly disappointing to hear. Moving on to the Q&A portion of our program. To the audience, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. I will not be able to get to all the questions, but I will ask as many as time permits. So a question from Stephen, a student at the University of Texas in Austin. Given the pandemic's economic strain on both Syria, Iraq, and neighboring states, would you expect a resurgence of the Islamic State as struggling people look to them for support?
I do not. I think the Islamic State has been beaten badly. The Syrian government has strengthened its military. It's not strong enough to take on Turkey, but I think it is strong enough to take on ISIS. To the extent that ISIS is going to continue operating in Syria, and it would do hit and run operations as it is doing now. I think it's partly because there's so many different militaries occupying Syria. The country remains fragmented. The Turkish army is in parts of Syria. So is the Russian Air Force. US troops are still stationed there, about 1,000. There's the Kurdish forces. So all of those different actors mean that Syria remains fragmented. There's no central government, and it's easy for ISIS to exploit that situation. But I don't see them becoming a major power.
Thank you. And a question from Al. Now, nearly 20 years hence, given the results from the power vacuum created in the attack, do you agree that the Iraq invasion was an American foreign policy calamity as well as a U.S. military disaster? And I'm assuming he is referring to the creation of ISIS stemming from the Iraq invasion.
Yes, I think it's very clear that the invasion of Iraq was a terrible blunder. We didn't achieve any of our goals. Iraq is today firmly in Iran's orbit, and Saudi Arabia is weakened by that. It's caused havoc across the region, like in Syria, and it's increased this terrible Shiite versus tensions. It's spread radical Islamist groups into the heartland of the Middle East from Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda got a big foothold in Iraq, and it's spread in other parts of the region. So it's been bad on almost every account. Of course, it's cost us a fortune as well.
Mm-hmm. And a question from Alan. What, if any, leverage does the U.S. have in shaping future Syrian politics?
Well, it can keep Syria very poor and fragmented, which is what it's doing today. And so I think America has a tremendous amount of power in the region, and that's it does, and it's kept the Kurds to a certain degree which is good for the Kurds, giving them a certain amount of autonomy, but not enough to really build up a state, unfortunately, but enough so that they're not under Syrian government. That's the one positive, but they're desperately want to rebuild. We're not helping reconstruct. I mean, you go to places like Raqqa today, and people are living in ruins, and there's no way for them to rebuild. They just don't have the money. Yeah.
Right. And a question from Don. What do you feel is the future of religious minorities in Syria? Even if al-Assad remains in power, do Syrian Christians have a future in the country?
You know, after World War II, there were about 15% Christians in Syria. Today, I would say they're around 4%. We don't have good numbers, but I think, you know, I've tried to get to the bottom of this by talking to religious leaders in Aleppo and about how their community, what the numbers are. And I think it's about 4%. So it's gone from 15 to 4. The same thing has happened in Iraq. It's not a good environment for minorities. Now, of course, Assad, you know, many minorities were very gratified that Assad won because they thought that worse things would happen if the rebels succeeded, particularly if ISIS or Al-Qaeda came to Damascus and took over. But, and many Lebanese Christians, of course, supported Assad in one way or another, and I did a number of interviews with Christian leaders, even Christian leaders who dislike Hezbollah in Lebanon intensely. But they were gratified that Hezbollah was fighting ISIS in Syria. So it was a very complicated landscape. And, you know, we keep on hoping that stability will return, at which point the Christian community, which is extremely educated, it's got great relations throughout Europe and with the United States, and can play a key role in reconstruction and education, as it has historically, that it will find will revive. But, you know, if you look at the numbers, just look at the numbers and the situation, it doesn't look good for minorities. There's been a real sorting out, as I've called it, and minorities have been leaving the Middle East in big numbers.
Thank you. What are the other geographic locations that are at risk of falling victim to the Russia, Iran, and US proxies?
Well, you know, to put it very simply, or very, you know, perhaps this is too much of a simplification, the countries which have large Shiite populations look to Iran. And that, of course, is Iraq, which is 60% Shiite, Lebanon, which is about 33% Shiite, Hezbollah, but a dominant military faction, and Syria, the Assad regime, which is where the Shiites are actually very few, and the Shiite-leaning people, but they look to Iran for protection. And Russia has exploited that situation because that was a entree for Russia to reassert itself in the Middle East. It had almost lost all of its power after 1990 and the collapse. But because America has sided so resolutely with the Sunnis, with Saudi Arabia and Sunni forces, to try to overturn the Iranian government, putting sanctions on Syria, you know, killing leading Shiite militia members in Iraq, that and in Yemen, that the Shiites in general look to Russia. So Russia and Iran have a future in the Middle East, not only because it's next door to them, but because there are many people who feel very oppressed in the Middle East and feel endangered, and they need support of Iran and Russia if they're not going to get killed or driven out of their homes. That's what they feel. And so that means they're going to be there for a long time.
A question from Sean. Per the U.S. goals mentioned, if there were to be an election in Syria, who do you anticipate would run for office? Any exiled politicians?
Well, if there were free elections, which there will not be, as long as Assad is ruling the country, sure, a lot of people would line up. The problem is that, as we've seen with the Syrian opposition, is that it's very hard to. There aren't parties that have developed, and the parties that have developed, like the Muslim Brotherhood, were destroyed by the Assad regime. And Assad has survived in power by dividing and conquering his opponents. And that means it's been very difficult for any parties to form. Where there has been sort of gentle revolution in the Middle East, like Tunisia, it's because there was always some politics where parties had survived. And in Egypt, you saw this too. The Muslim Brotherhood had not been destroyed. It had been allowed, even though it had been, elections had been rigged, it was still a party. And that saved the country, I think, from civil war to a certain degree, because you did have an organized opposition. In Syria, there was no organized opposition. There was nobody who could rein in the radicals.
Right. An anonymous question here. How many Syrians are living outside the country, and what must happen to give them an opportunity to return? What advice would you have for the incoming president?
Boy. 6 million Syrians, at least 6 million, probably more than that, who live outside. And there are Syrians who've been here for generations because they are victims of earlier migrations, whether it was starting with Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s, through the Ba'ath Party, coups, Muslim Brotherhood, destruction of the Muslim Brotherhood. People have been flowing out of Syria. And that has been the leading technique of the government in Damascus with opponents, which is to make life miserable for them and kick them out of the country, figuring, they're gone, we won't have to deal with them. So there is a giant diaspora of people who would like to go home and have their relatives, their children, so forth. Obviously, they almost got that chance. The problem was unifying. That was the big problem. And coming, deciding whether you're going to be secular or Islamist, and getting a vote, getting unified in the Syrian National Council, which didn't happen. And it really became inoperative. And it caused the West to turn away from it. But I don't see where things are going to change in the immediate future, because the regional powers that are backing Assad are so determined. Now, most Syrians I know that have, that didn't want a military situation in Syria and have sort of been quiet, because they are hoping the Russians will force Assad out and sort of change and put another Alawite leader in instead of Assad. I don't think there's any hope for that. I'm very pessimistic about the opportunities for change in the near future. Of course, something cataclysmic could happen, but I don't see it. I don't see where in the near future we're going to get change in Syria. So I don't know how to counsel, except for to try to educate Syrians in the outside, and to organize them into parties so that there will be some unified parties that can, the next time, there's a crack in Syria, which there very well may be, that Syria will be more organized and ready to exploit the situation.
Thank you very much, Joshua. For the sake of time, that will be the end of our program. And thank you, Joshua, again for sharing your knowledge with us. And to those of you watching, thank you for tuning in. Please check our website for our upcoming events, and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we upload all of our conversations. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Well, thank you, Basma. It was a pleasure. And Marianne Maldonado, thank you for inviting me. And Ronan O'Malley, also, thank you. It's been wonderful to meet you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.